Hi everyone. Those of you who've been following the global conversation will probably have heard the name of John Scotus Eriugena recently, because he's been coming up, especially in discussions with John Vervaeke. Eriugena was actually a medieval monk who formulated an interesting theory of creation, which actually matches pretty well with the sort of naturalism that John Vervaeke is defending. So, as a consequence, in order to better understand and discuss with John Vervaeke, I've been trying to dive into the works of Eriugena over the last couple of weeks, and I thought I'd make a quick video to explain what has been most helpful to me to understand what Eriugena is trying to point at. And that is Eriugena's symbolic reading of the days of creation in Genesis. I'm not going to talk about Eriugena's entire symbolic reading of Genesis because everything is in there, so it would take forever. I just want to try to focus on especially the days, because this is what has helped me more precisely understand what is so novel about Eriugena's divisions of nature. I'll proceed in 3 steps. I'll first say a few words about the divisions of nature. Then I'll speak more directly about his symbolic reading of the days of creation. And finally, I'll come back to the divisions of nature to say a few more things. If you Google Eriugena, what you'll find most quickly is his fourfold division of nature. This is what he is most original for. The first 3 divisions are actually very standard. You can find them in basically all versions of Neoplatonic Christianity. It's the 4th division which will be more controversial and which will make all the difference for Eriugena's scheme. So let me just say a few words about each of them and why Eriugena is proposing something novel. The first division of nature is the uncreated creating nature. This is the ground of being which sustains everything in existence. It's the first cause of everything from which everything can emerge. It's God. It's fairly standard up till now. The second division is also fairly standard. It's the primordial causes. It's everything that is created but is also creating. Typically, this will be, for instance, the ideas in the mind of God. In Neoplatonism, it's the intellect. You could also include, let's say, potential. The potential from which things will be able to emerge. Still uncontroversial up until now, the idea that from God emanates creating things which are created from God by emanation. The third division, also uncontroversial, is the world of finite things, of earthly objects, things that are created and do not create, such as us, such as this board, for instance. And as I said, up to now, this is not controversial. You can find this in Neoplatonism and Neoplatonic versions of Christianity, where you have the ground of being, from which emanates primordial causes, from which emanate finite objects. Not controversial up until now. What Eriugena does, though, is he has a fourth division. This is the uncreated uncreating. And there are several things which are weird about this. First, it's not clear that this even exists to most people. And even more controversially, not only will Eriugena say that this exists, he will say that this is God. And really, this will allow Eriugena to talk about on the one end, as in Neoplatonism, an emanation from God to created things, but also an emergence back towards God from those created things. Before I say more about this, I'm gonna talk about the different days of creation, because this is what makes most clear, I think, the divisions we can see here. As I said, this is a symbolic reading of the days of creation, meaning that Eriugena doesn't think that the different days of creation refer to a temporal sequence of events where on, let's say, the first 24 hours got this, then the next 24 hours got this, and so on. Eriugena rather asserts, as is fairly typical of readings of Genesis, that what is depicted in the days of creation occurs ontologically at every level of being. At every instance, not at every level of being, at every moment in time, this sequence of events occurs ontologically. So, meaning at every instant, God creates the heaven and the earth, and then all of the things in between. So, without further ado, let's get to it. In the first day, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. Eriugena sees this as the first division, creating the first division. The second division. This isn't controversial yet. You have the ground of being, which is creating the primordial causes, meaning that, well, the heavens, the invisible, contain the forms, contain the ideas of God, from which things will then be created, and also conversely on the earth, which is without form and void, you have basically potential, from which things will be able to emerge. So in the first day, you have the uncreated creating, which is creating the created creating. Not controversial yet, but then later on the first day, and there's a pattern here where starting from there up until the end of day 6, God speaks things into being, and then he sees that what he has made is good. Okay, so every time God speaks something into being, it's written, and then God said, let there so and so. Eriugena sees this as God creating, not directly as when he created the first causes, but through the primordial causes, finite things. So a way to see it is from the primordial causes, there's lots of possibilities, and God, via his word, can select between them. So God creates through the primordial causes the finite things. Okay, and still, up until now, this isn't also controversial yet. It becomes more interesting when Eriugena interprets God seeing that what he has made is good, but I'm not going to talk about this just yet. I think it's better to digress quickly to day 7 and then to come back to those occurrences. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested. Eriugena interprets the rest of God to show that God is not exhausted by his creation, that the uncreated does not have to always create and is not exhausted by what he creates. So this points to the 4th division, which Eriugena says that such a thing exists, the uncreated, uncreating nature. This is the side of God which is not exhausted. This is the inexhaustible, the possibilities which are still open to God, and so on. Eriugena identifies this with God. And further, this will become important. Not only is God not exhausted, not only does the 7th day show that God, not only does the 7th day illustrate that God is not exhausted by creation, it also explains that every time God sees that what he has made is good, this is a form of rest, this is a form of enjoyment of God seeing what he has made. And further, Eriugena goes farther. He says that God even sees himself in what he has created, because what he sees is good. It's himself. It's an expression, a manifestation of himself. Okay. And as I said, this can become controversial because the repercussions here are quite important. What Eriugena sees is that God, as the ground of being, will, on the one hand, create, will emanate from him the created creating, and ultimately the created uncreating, so that those things can emerge back to him as good, so that God can rest and enjoy what he has created, that he can see himself, so that he can see his manifestations in things. And I should note that Eriugena has been accused of pantheism for this, because he says that God sees himself in creation, and maybe the best way, I think, to see it is not, I don't think it's that heretical, I think it makes sense. What Eriugena really wants to say is that nothing can exist apart from God. this is straightforward. I mean, if creation was really separate from God, it would mean that God was somehow limited, or that creation would somehow be able to exist without the ground of being, without God, which makes no sense. So what Eriugena means really is that creation is in the bosom of God, so to speak. Creation is a manifestation of God. But Eriugena is really careful not to say that this exhausts God. Eriugena wants to say that God does learn to know himself in creation, that God does unfold himself in creation so that he can know himself more, but that God is not exhausted by this. God always remains uncreated, and there's also a side of him which is not exhausted, which is uncreating. So I think that's how Eriugena can defend himself fairly effectively against pantheism. Doesn't mean that Eriugena doesn't have other potentially heretical ideas, but at least the accusations of pantheism, I think, are not really warranted. So that's really all I wanted to tell you guys today. I wanted to explain how the seventh day of creation can illustrate how Eriugena sees God as resting at every moment, not being exhausted by what exists, as always being more, as always being open to more possibilities. So I hope this was useful, and thanks for listening.